So hello, good evening and welcome. Can everyone hear me? Just to make sure this is working. Great. I'm Jaramillo, the Director of Creative Writing here at the new school. There are a lot of writers and editors here, word people, but to all my math nerd brothers and sisters out there, happy Pi Day. On behalf of the new school, I'm so happy to welcome back our friends from the National Book Critics Circle. For close to 20 years, we've been honored to host the awards ceremony here in this auditorium. We're very proud of our partnership with the NBCC, and this year, for the 5th year, graduate and honor students from the Creative Writing Program interviewed the award finalists and honorees in a series of interviews that are posted on our blog and on the NBCC website, and also for the first time on Brooklyn Magazine's website. Here's a quick story. In 2015 and 2016, one of our students, Yadan Israel, participated in this program, interviewing the historian Ezra Greenspan the first year, and in the second year, Ta-Nehisi Coates. When Yadan graduated, he joined the NBCC board, and then this fall, he was named the editor-in-chief of Brooklyn Magazine. Yadan is this year the VP for Membership and Awards, and it is through his continued generosity and his dedication to building literary bridges that we now have this partnership connecting Brooklyn Magazine, the NBCC, and creative writing students at the New School. So I'd like to give a huge thank you to Yadan for this connection. Thank you to everyone else who helped put this together. It's an extraordinary task of coordination. This job couldn't have been done without the leadership and vision of John Reed, a former NBCC board member and beloved faculty member here at the New School. Thank you to Kelly Stewart and Wynn Contos. Thank you to all the publicists for the finalists for bringing our students and honorees together. Thank you to the students who participated. Thank you to David Varno. Huge thank you to Jane Chabatari, and of course to the rest of the NBCC board. I'd also like to thank Justin Sherwood, Ben Fama, Lori Lynn Turner, Pamela Tillis, and Sylvan Simon, and thank you all for coming. I'd now like to turn the evening over to Kate Tuttle, board president of the National Book Critics Circle. Please join me in welcoming Kate to the stage.
Good evening. I'm Kate Tuttle, president of the National Book Critics Circle, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this reading by many of the finalists for the National Book Critics Circle Awards for the publishing year 2017. The awards are designed to honor the outstanding work of the publishing year in 6 categories: autobiography, biography, criticism, fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. I'd like to extend our gratitude to the authors who have joined us here tonight, coming from near and far to share their remarkable work. We congratulate each and every one of you for your exceptional achievements. And thank you to the New School University, especially Luis Jaramillo, Lori Lynn Turner, and Ben Fama of the Creative Writing Program for hosting us again this year. I hope you all will return to join us tomorrow night in this same place at 6:30 p.m., where we'll be presenting the awards. That ceremony, like tonight's reading, is free and open to the public. In addition to the awards in 6 categories, we'll be presenting 3 special awards: the Nona Balakian Citation for Excellence in Reviewing, given this year to Charles Finch; the John Leonard Prize for a First Book, which will go to Carmen Maria Machado for her fiction collection, Her Body and Other Parties, Stories; and the Ivan Sandroff Lifetime Achievement Award, which we'll be presenting to John McPhee. After the awards ceremony, we'll hold our annual reception and fundraiser. You can purchase tickets here tonight or buy them tomorrow at the door. In addition, the Strand Bookstore is just outside the auditorium tonight, selling copies of books by all the finalists, signed by those in attendance. We encourage you to patronize them. One more bookkeeping event, if you don't mind. I want to invite all of you to join us at the Brooklyn Public Library, March 20th at 7:30 p.m., where we'll be putting on a panel discussion about criticism and social justice. It includes a lot of NBCC board members, former winners and finalists, and it's going to be a great event. As you can see from your programs, not every finalist could be here this evening to read. A number of our finalists this year live overseas, and others couldn't be here due to scheduling conflicts. There's one change to tonight's program. Fiction finalist Jesmyn Ward could not join us. Beyond that, we'll stick to the order on your programs. We'll dispense with introductions and ask that readers come onto the stage, one after the other, in the order listed. To kick things off, I'd like to welcome to the stage Nuar Alsadir, a finalist in poetry.
Fourth person singular is largely a book of fragments, so I'm going to start at the beginning and jump around. The door to my interior was propped open and a fly buzzed in. To repossess my thoughts as a car gets repossessed if payment hasn't been made, but what kind of debt is owed and to whom? The photos on the wall of his house, dashing, then death, like the moment before fainting, the voices on the car radio shifting from the rear to the front speakers, subito, fortissimo, then. I stood in the loudness of my thoughts like a cutout superimposed onto the background scene. Shots of sidebar and awe. Hemingway would record every detail around an event, say a bomb exploding, then take out the event and leave only its reverberations. I have been walking through reverberations with no sense of what the event was. Why did they care so much, all the king's horses and all the king's men? Was nothing else happening in the kingdom? Was Humpty Dumpty somehow important to the greater good? Or was it the impulse to put the pieces back together again, revert to an idyllic image of cohesion, avoid fragmentation at all cost? Picasso's faces are Humpty and loss. Tonight I will go out with the face of shatter, Cubist celebration without hankering to cohere. I went to a party. Everyone seemed the same, strangers. God will vomit out the lukewarm. A yes so out of tune it sounds like a no, and I can't tell what I'm listening to. Another storm, wind so strong it blew the door open 3 times in the night. Can there be revelation without chaos? Recycling bins flying into the middle of the street? Can't eat, can't sleep. I'm burning in the St. Augustine way. To Clinton Hill then I came, burning, burning. I feel the hum of the bus in the sole of my boot. Electric ecstasy. Alextasy. Sadness folds the chair I would have sat on. Jeans carry the shape of the person who inhabits them. If you pick up another person's jeans, you both hold that person and erase them. The redactions are closer to my heart. Pleasure and disgust, the border of desire, of aesthetics, where beauty and the uncanny meet. Is this the brink one must always live on, bare and bare, the vulnerability necessitated in feeling alive? When I have bared myself, I feel a compulsion to send out a flurry of signals to adjust the reception of others, to scramble the image that may have been momentarily revealed of me. The moral is, of course, don't write one-act plays. Punctuation of grief. Thank you.
My name is James Longenbach, and I'm going to read a poem called Suitcase. Oh, really? My name is James Longenbach. Is that better? Thank you. And I'm going to read a poem called Suitcase, which is the first poem in this book. Suitcase. No one can predict the size, the shape, or even the location of the room where you will spend a long time. But every time you pack, you're thinking about that room. You're imagining the color of the draperies. You're deciding the desk should face the window in summer when the sun is overhead, but face the wall in winter when the light's so low it hits you in the eyes. In winter, there are no distractions. You study the wall. But in summer, the trolley stops in front of the Ministry of Public Instruction. Usually it sits there. Nobody moves. But sometimes it's crossing the river, little houses, new apartments, bodies smelling fresh in the morning, rank at night. When I pack, I lay out every sock, each pair of shorts without a fold. If my shirts are too large to lie down flat, I tuck their arms beneath their sides to fill the suitcase perfectly. A window, the desk, a lamp, and a chair. One of life's greatest pleasures, if I'm permitted to use that phrase, is packing a suitcase. It's not like building a fire when you want to leave space for air. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me? It's a real honor to be here, so thank you. I'm Layli, long soldier, by the way. Whereas, when offered an apology, I watch each movement, the shoulders, high or folding, tilt of the head, both eyes down or straight through. Me, I listen for cracks in knuckles or in the word choice. What is it that I want to feel? And mind you, I feel from the senses. I read each muscle. I ask the strength of the gesture to move like a poem. Expectations, a terse arm fold, a failing noun thing. I scold myself in the mirror for holding. Because I learn from young poets. One sends me new work, spotted with salt crystals, she metaphors as her tears. I feel her phrases. I say, and understand me, and I wonder. Pages are cavernous places, white at entrance, black in absorption, echo. If I'm transformed by language, I am often crouched in footnote or blazing in title. Where in the body do I begin? Whereas I heard a noise I thought was a sneeze at the breakfast table, pushing eggs around my plate. I wondered if he liked my cooking, thought about what to talk about. He pinched his fingers to the bridge of his nose, squeezed his eyes. He wiped. I often say he was a terrible drinker when I was a child. I'm not afraid to say it because he's different now. Sober, attentive, showered, eating. But in my childhood, when things were different, I rolled onto my side, my hands together as if to pray, locked between my knees. When things were different, I lay there for long hours, my face to the wall, blank. My eyes left me, my soldiers, my 2 scouts to the unseen. And because language is the immaterial, I never could speak about the missing. So perhaps I cried for the invisible, what I could not see doubly. What is it to wish for the absence of nothing? There at the breakfast table, as an adult, wondering what to talk about, if he liked my cooking, pushing the invisible to the plate's edge. I looked up to see he hadn't sneezed. He was crying. I'd never heard him cry, didn't recognize the symptoms. I turned to him when I heard him say, I'm sorry. I wasn't there. Sorry for many things. Like that curative voicing, an opened bundle or medicine or birthday wishing, my hand to his shoulder. It's okay, I said. It's over now, I meant it. Because of our faces blankly, because of a lifelong stare down, because of centuries in sorry. Thank you.
I'm going to read 2 poems from the final sequence in my book. The sequence is about the elusive search for truth and justice in the aftermath of a bloody civil war. And the speaker in the first poem is an interpreter taking part in a war trial. And the second poem is about the impossibility, I suppose, of sanitizing the past. The interpreter. I think of the places where the truth was lost. In the corner of a bar where 6 men met, or was it 5? No record of what was said, or who said what, or what was decided. 12 people lost their lives in the feud that followed. Claims and counterclaims. What of the rumours of collusion? Those darkened cars parked in the woods as for a lover's tryst. Denials on all sides, bullets in the post, and several public figures fleeing abroad. Not one page of their ghost-written memoirs can be trusted. And who shot the Minister of Defence in that famous square in the capital where their nation lives its history? Was it a rebel conspiracy, or army factions intent, if others are to be believed, on provoking civil war. At cafe tables, on trains and buses, whenever 2 or 3 were gathered, the truth was lost. In kitchens too, in hospital corridors, in the chambers of august institutions, the truth was, at best, approximate or completely realigned. As one professor of politics dared to remark, we're all revisionists now and shall be again. Meanwhile, our 3 judges stoutly pursue the evidence there is to be had from the witnesses. Whatever emerges will be labelled truth. The accused will hang or be confined to a psychiatric hospital. The party in power will begin to rewrite the history books. The past will feed its truth into the present process the past, as year after year the bones of the disappeared rise from bogs and forests and deserted beaches, bringing one kind of truth, the truth of the mortuary slab. And year after year, the testimony of those who stayed silent may open paths to where the truth was lost. The Willow Forest. What with the pogroms, the genocide, the ethnic cleansing, the secret massacres, the mass graves, the death camps, the public executions, at last there was nobody left. The country was empty. Survivors who reached the border became refugees. Rebuked by that silence beyond the mountains, the victors planted willows, and in due course the country grew into a willow forest. The trees hung their heads over a history that now memorialized could be forgotten. Except that the few who visited spoke of a weight that was more than gravity, a wind in the trees that stilled to a kind of weeping. Thank you very much.
This has to come down. Hi, I'm so delighted to be here. I'm Carina Chocano, and this is from an essay called The Kick-Ass, so it's a little change of pace. Just after the 2000 Florida election recount, my boyfriend and I flew to Vero Beach, Florida, to spend Christmas with his parents. They were elderly and Republican, and unlike many Floridians, had voted for George W. Bush on purpose. This could have made for some Chad-related awkwardness at the dinner table, but we stuck to safe topics during our nightly excursions to Chili's and the Outback Steakhouse. By the end of the holiday, I was exhausted, depressed, and very bloated. All I wanted to do was get back to California, where I could resume trashing Katherine Harris from a safe distance while eating at restaurants that didn't require waiters to memorize lines. On our last day, on the way to the airport, we stopped in Orlando to visit my boyfriend's brother and his tiny manicurist girlfriend. They suggested we eat in the then newish fake town of Celebration. I perked up. I had just seen The Truman Show and I was dying to go. Celebration was a master-planned community built by the Walt Disney Company. I don't know what the master plan was exactly, but it looked truly diabolical. The town was built according to Walt Disney's original vision for what he called an experimental prototype community of tomorrow, or Epcot, which turned out to be more of an experimental prototype community of yesteryear, a themed, sanitized version of a small American town from a time before never. The strangest thing about it was that it felt scrubbed free of all branding and advertising, with the exception, of course, of constant allusions to Disney, the brand residents were literally inhabiting. Celebration wasn't a place, so much as an idea made manifest. The idea of transferring your entire existence into a controlled, frictionless fantasy where time could be denied and the world remade to conform to the brand's values. Celebration was a celebration of fear sublimated into nostalgia, of longing for a time that never existed, when nothing was confusing. It was all super scary, totalizing ideology, speculative fiction, except it was nonfiction. After lunch at a bright, colorful Cuban restaurant, where in short order I consumed a mojito the size of a watering can, we stepped outside into the dazzling Florida sunshine, and we were suddenly caught up in a regularly scheduled fake snowfall, accompanied by piped-in Christmas music. Oh, sure, nobody blinks an eye now. Sure, now I'll meet my friends for dinner and fake snowfalls at the Grove, an outdoor mall in Los Angeles, around Christmas time because the kids like it. But at the time, probably because I was buzzed and really excited to get on that plane, something shifted, and I felt myself yield like butter to the engineered, pathologically dishonest pleasure of the experience. Maybe I expect too much from life. Maybe a fake approximation of winter, of snow, of a town, of a Cuban restaurant, of an election, of a democracy, and of a president should have been enough. Maybe I should have counted my blessings and shoved down the bad feelings, but things took a very dark turn for me after we went back to my boyfriend's brother's house to pick up some guns. And I sat slumped in the back seat of the SUV like a sullen teenager, listening to Rush Limbaugh fulminate at top volume as the euphoric effects of the cocktail wore off. Suddenly, I had no idea who I was or how I had arrived at this curious place, not just Florida, all of it. What was I doing here? Could I be here and still be myself? Who was I? By the time we reached the shooting range, I was in the grip of a full-blown identity crisis. And within seconds of stepping inside, I burst into tears, bolted for the door, and spent the rest of the afternoon alone in the backseat of the car reading Jane Austen.
Good evening. My name is Edwidge Danticat, and this is from The Art of Death. When my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer in early 2014, every time we'd go to see a doctor more than once, she would ask me to give the doctor one of my books. She underestimated how embarrassing it was for me to seem to be bribing someone with something that was precious to me, but that they might consider absolutely worthless. I would tell her I'd do it, then we would quickly move on to the next doctor, and the one after that, each of whom would bring us more and more dire news, until my mother no longer considered them worthy of any gifts at all. The one doctor she insisted on was her oncologist, Dr. Blyden. One day while I was drilling Dr. Blyden with my internet research-inspired questions, he interrupted me to ask what I do for a living. I told him I am a writer. My mother wanted me to give Dr. Blyden a copy of my 2007 memoir, Brother, I'm Dying, in which I describe, among other things, my mother's early years with my father, who had died of pulmonary fibrosis a decade before. My mother smiled as I handed Dr. Blyden the book. She even smiled at Dr. Blyden's two observing medical students. As he walked out of the room, Dr. Blyden looked back at my mother, and I imagined him seeing her in a slightly different light. Until then, I hadn't quite understood the power of a moment like this, a moment where your apparent value suddenly rises in the eyes of someone else, especially someone who has your life in his hands. In subsequent visits, though, Dr. Blyden never mentioned the book again. The last time my mother and I were in Dr. Blyden's course, "Tell him it's up to God now," my mother said in Creole, using me yet again as her translator. After a long pause, Dr. Blyden agreed that at her age, 78, the type of rigorous treatment she would now need might considerably reduce her quality of life. Lingering longer than usual with us, Dr. Blyden told us about a patient of his who was the same age as my mother and had the same diagnosis. That patient had also decided to stop treatment after one round of chemo. "Where is she now?" my mother asked after I'd translated this for her. "On a cruise," the doctor said. Dr. Blyden had told us this, I realized, to show his support for my mother's choice, and for that, my mother seemed grateful. At least that other dying woman was feeling well enough to go on a cruise, I imagine her thinking. As my mother and I were leaving Dr. Blyden's office that day, I heard him tell one of his medical students something that made me understand even better why my mother had made me a one-woman bookmobile on her behalf. "This is a special woman," Dr. Blyden said, referring to my mother. "She raised an author." My mother beamed. Her big, broad smile made me want to run from the doctor's office and shout irrationally to everyone in my path, "My mother is dying, but I write books." Thank you.
Hello. Camille Dungy. In the years before her death, my maternal grandmother told me the story of her family's flight from Shreveport to Somerville, Louisiana. My great-grandfather, who owned his own sheet metal shop in that left-behind town, who could read and write and figure, and who understood his worth, entered his business one morning and found his young cousin dead on a work table. A note pinned to the body warned my great-grandfather to get out of town by nightfall. The surviving family piled into a wagon with nothing but what the wagon could hold. "Imagine that," my grandmother said repeatedly in the last years of her life. She didn't talk much about the new shop or the new town. In the years before she died, it was that wagon my grandmother talked about, loaded with what things her family could haul, and that life plucked from her family's line. Most Black American families have a story of some branch brutally severed from their family tree. The only remarkable thing about my grandmother's story is that she had to reach as far back as 1917 to encounter such trauma. But pain is an immortal humor, lasting in a body far longer than pleasure. Again and again, my grandmother asked me, as if I might, one visit, provide some satisfactory answer. What would make a person do that to a body? We might be playing with the baby, grandmother's namesake. We might be sitting in the nursing home's courtyard. Once, we were in the communal dining room, surrounded by the dying white Iowans with whom my grandparents spent their final years. She looked around as if startled to find herself among strangers and whispered the story of her family's flight as if it were a story that I, that moment, for my very survival, needed to hear. Grandmother's voice shook, not from age, but from a hard-driven grief that spoke through muscle to bone. This must be what they mean by visceral terror. My grandmother repeated the story because she could not help but remember. She was there. She walked into the shop and saw her cousin. She climbed into the wagon and rode through the dust. She felt her father's fear-born defiance and caution. She saw her pregnant mother, several siblings, packed up and driven off before the last of the light. She was there, you understand? And she had to tell me. Though she would likely have been too young at the time to remember the incident. This, too, is possible. Hers was the small body inside her mother's body. She might not yet have even been conceived. This is how history eclipses all reality. My grandmother, who could not help but relive this trauma, was also as far away from everything I am writing as you and as me. Thank you.
Hi, good night. It is an honor to be here. As we drive from southwestern New Mexico toward Arizona, it becomes more and more difficult to ignore the uncomfortable irony of it. We're traveling in the direction opposite the undocumented children whose stories we are now following so closely. As we get closer to the border and begin taking back roads, we don't see a single migrant, child or adult. We see other things, though, that indicate their ghostly presence, past or future. Along the narrow dirt road in New Mexico that goes from a ghost town called Shakespeare to another town called Animas, we see a trail of flags that volunteer groups tie to trees or fences, indicating that there are tanks filled with water there for people to drink as they cross the desert. Occasionally, we are overtaken by big pickup trucks, and it's hard not to imagine the men behind their steering wheels, big men with big beards or shaved heads or abundant tattoos, vigilant, patriotic men who carry pistols and rifles by constitutional right and feel entitled to use them if they see a group of aliens walking in the desert. As we approach Animas, we also begin to see fleeting herds of Border Patrol cars, like ominous white stallions racing toward the horizon. We decide not to tell anyone in diners and gas stations that we're Mexican, just in case. But we are stopped a few times by Border Patrol officials and have to show our passports and display big smiles when we explain we're just riders and just on vacation. We have to confirm that, yes, we are only riders, even if, yes, we are also Mexican. Why are we there? And what are we writing? They always want to know. We're writing a Western, sir. That's what we tell them, that we're writing a Western. We also tell them we came to Arizona for the open skies and the silence and the emptiness. The second part more true than the part about writing the Western, which is not true. Handing back our passports, one official says sardonically, "So you come all the way down here for the inspiration?" We know better than to contradict anyone who carries a badge and a gun, so we just say, "Yes, sir." Because how do you explain that it's never inspiration that drives you to tell a story, but rather a combination of anger and clarity? How do you say, no, we don't find inspiration here, but we find a country that is as beautiful as it is broken, and we are somehow now part of it, so we are also broken with it, and feel ashamed, confused, and sometimes hopeless, and are trying to figure out how to do something about all that. Thank you.
And everything. A bit of prank or Easter egg as a thank you to those readers who went on this journey through the finite jests found in the hoax. It would be much like the fake entries in encyclopedias meant to catch plagiarists. Unique by design, such an entry, if it appears in another book, proves the whole thing was nabbed, a hoax for us hoax catchers to find. But no, I realize that would defeat the point, to tell the truth about those who weren't just telling it slant, but who also sought to make slants seem like truth. Spin, say so, hooey, fiddle, Mickey Mousing, jazzed. Truth be told, I realize now I could never compete with the ways that the half-hoax world I worried over and wrote against has given way to a full-time one. Fact check gone from a rare word to a dirty word. Equivalence, dating from the late 19th century, means the willful avoidance of one's official responsibilities. According to the New Oxford American Dictionary, the term likely comes from, quote, the French esquiver, dodge, slink away. Except the entry is bunk, purposefully made up to trap anyone who copied the dictionary. The ploy worked. Its, quote, inherent fakeitude is fairly obvious, the creator declared when the entry was discovered in 2005. We were trying to make a word that could not arise in nature. Today's hoaxes rely less on human nature or collective memory than cultural amnesia. We quickly erase hoaxes once exposed, excising the monstrous palimpsest, because as with any witch hunt or obvious fake, afterward, we can't quite explain why we ever believed the outrageous thing in the first place. The resulting de-hoaxing leads to outrage, for the hoax reminds us, uncomfortably, that the stories we tell don't just express the society of the self, they construct it. Till now, we've spoken of our millennial narrative crisis as if the stories we tell could be separated from the self who tells them. But now it must be said that just as our technology often outstrips its users, so have our contemporary stories more and more outstripped the self. The recent plagiarism plague and its corresponding confessions surf the sea change I call the age of euphemism. Euphemisms for sale, homemade, all natural, artisanal, post-factual. All along, I hoped this book would have a happy ending, to be able to say as though that though we've experienced a tsunami of hoaxes, the tide has crested and now we're on the other side. Smooth sailing from here on out. At least no more drowning. This wish seems to me now particularly American, realizing what William Howells told Edith Wharton, or at least what we think he said. What the American public always wants is a tragedy with a happy ending. What if truth is not an absolute or relative, but a skill, a muscle like memory, that collectively we have neglected so much that we have grown measurably weaker at using it? How might we rebuild it, going from chronic to bionic? The facts are on our side. Let's hope the fictions once again will be too. Funk, hokum, Blue Devils, The Trap, The Blues.
Good evening. My name is T. Bowie. I'll be reading from the best we could do in words and pictures tonight. I imagine the awe and excitement that I felt for New York when I moved here after college must be something like what my father felt when he arrived in Saigon in 1955. Bo and his grandfather were two bachelors exploring the big city. Money in their pockets, freedom on their minds. They strolled down grand avenues, ate at restaurants, garçon, and visited friends and relatives. When his grandfather wanted some time away from him, here's some money, go see a movie. Bo's grandmother arrived in Saigon separately on the last of the great ships from the north. Grandma! Let's make a new home together. No, I don't need you. Bo's grandmother rented a flat with two other women. This way, Auntie. But fate would soon drive her back to her unfaithful husband. The South had a new prime minister named Ngo Dinh Diem, who had yet to establish full control of the region. Saigon had its own mafia called the Binh Xuyen, who controlled the casinos, the brothels, and the drug trade. Ziemp's forces fought the Bing Xuyen in the streets of Saigon. One night, the fighting came right to the doorstep of Bo's grandmother. Ow, my opium jars! Pow, pow. Stay down. Plunk. With her securities gone and scared of more violence, Bo's grandmother agreed to go back to her cheating husband. Huh? Grandma? And Bo had a family again. They pooled their money together and bought a little house for the equivalent of $5,000. $5,000 seems pretty cheap for a house in the capital. It was really just the space between two other houses. Wait, I've got paper. Can you draw it for me? Someone had topped it with a roof made of palm leaves. Inside, they lined it with cardboard to give it the semblance of a house. But to me, at age 14, it was a home, an address. This is the house I lived in, only a lot later. Yes, but by that time, they had added another story to it. It was still small and dirty. Do you remember it? No, I was too little. My first home. I went to see the old house with my family in 2001, the time that Bo refused to go. Travis and I were newlyweds. I had a short, impulsive haircut. The street had changed beyond recognition. Miraculously, an old neighbor still lived across the alley, recognized my mother, and came out to talk to us. Aren't you Nam's wife? There, that's your house. Oh, I thought it was that one. That was Mr. Gunn's house. Mr. and Mrs. Gunn lived in that one. No, that's Mrs. Yao. He's right, Ma. Ah, that's right, Big. This is our house. We each had our own reaction to this homecoming. Lan already scouting ahead. Ma and Big the most excited. Me and Thumb documenting in low remembering. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Caroline Fraser. On a spring day in April of 1924, Laura Ingalls Wilder, a 57-year-old farm wife in the Missouri Ozarks, received a telegram from South Dakota. Her mother, Caroline Ingalls, had just died. Wilder hadn't seen her for more than 20 years. A few weeks later, still reeling, she wrote a brief note to be published in place of her regular column in a farm newspaper. Every woman in the world who has lost her mother will recognize the retrospective shadow of sorrow, regret, and crippling nostalgia that the news cast across her life. Some of us have received such messages, she said flatly. Those who have not, one day will. Then it all became too much to bear. Memories, she wrote. We go through life collecting them whether we will or not. Sometimes I wonder if they are our treasures in heaven or the consuming fires of torment when we carry them with us as we too pass on. It was a startling public outburst for a woman in a small Missouri town known to her neighbors as reserved, poised, even withdrawn. She seemed anguished by her memories, willed and unwilled. The realization that she would be visited for the rest of her life by images of people and places she could never forget was dismaying to her. They are with us forever, she wrote, as if in disbelief. As children, we thought we knew her. She was the real-life pioneer girl who survived wildfires, tornadoes, malaria, blizzards, and near starvation on the Great Plains in the late 1800s. She was the fierce, uncompromising tomboy who grew up to write famous books about her life, Little House in the Big Woods, Little House on the Prairie. She was the woman whose true life stories went on to sell over 60 million copies in 45 languages and were reincarnated in the 1970s and 80s as one of the longest-running, most popular shows in television history, still in syndication. But as adults, we have come to see that her autobiographical novels were not only fictionalized, but brilliantly edited in a profound act of American myth-making and self-transformation. As unpublished manuscripts, letters, and documents have come to light, we have begun to apprehend the scope of her life, a story that needs to be fully told in its historical context as she lived it. That tale is different from the one she wrote. It is an adult story of poverty, struggle, and reinvention, a great American drama in 3 acts. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Edmund Gordon, and this is from my biography of the British novelist Angela Carter. Why should anyone be interested in my boring, alienated, marginal, messy life? Angela Carter wondered. But even as she framed the question, she was gesturing towards one of the strongest links between her life and her work, which was about the nature of alienation. It was an unusual subject for a middle-class Englishwoman, raised in the capital city of the British Empire, educated at a private school and a good civic university. She refused identification with any of these things, feeling that although alienation could be painful, integration means giving up one's freedom of being in that one becomes mastered by one's role. This belief that ourselves are neither false nor true, but merely roles we either master or are mastered by, is one of the central themes of Angela Carter's fiction. Her characters wear their personalities like so many fancy dress costumes. She was explicit about viewing femininity as a social fiction, part of a culturally choreographed performance of selfhood. She wasn't the first person to make this observation, but she may have been the first to greet it so warmly as a license for boundless self-invention. Her own personality displayed splashes of fancy dress. She enjoyed making people laugh and had a knack for the startling, side-splitting phrase. She swerved between registers from foul-mouthed demotic to jargon-strewn highbrow so abruptly that neither seemed to be quite her natural voice. At other moments, she spoke with such exquisite courtesy, accompanied by such pantomime gestures of deference, that people tended to suspect her of irony. Her face was unusually mobile, her expression modulating swiftly from uncertainty to amusement. She had a girlish, delicate voice, high-pitched and quite posh, with a few flat South London vowels sprinkled about like ballast. Her conversation tended to circle back on itself as she refined a point or improved a phrase. Hearing her speak, you get a strong sense of how her mind worked, how she wrote. She would leave long pauses while she collected her thoughts, often waving a hand in the air as if to net the mot juste. She had a mild stutter, and she put emphasis in strange places in a sentence. Her talk ebbed and flowed, her pauses ending in a rush of speech, as if the pressure of thought had been building up. Her laughter came just as suddenly, but in 2 distinct varieties. The most frequent was a barely audible wheezing chuckle, accompanied by a mischievous, conspiratorial glint in her grey-blue eyes. But when she laughed properly, her mouth fell open, her whole face creased up, and she turned a startling shade of red. The way people look, how they speak, the quality and frequency of their laughter, all these things help shape our understanding of them, for if we invent ourselves, we also invent one another. Angela knew this. In 1969, she wrote, "I feel like Archimedes and have just made what seems to me a profound insight, that one's personality is not a personal thing at all, but an imaginative construct in the eye of the beholder." Even so, she loathed it when people constructed her in ways that weren't compatible with how she saw herself. Several witnesses recall the party at which an editor at a national newspaper, a woman who had idealized her as a New Age role model, an Earth mother, asked her to write something on the summer solstice at Stonehenge. Angela looked pityingly at the woman and said, "You just haven't got me, have you, dear?" Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Howard Markell, and I'm going to talk about cornflakes. This morning, more than 350 million people devoured a bowl of Kellogg's cornflakes. Hundreds of millions more started their day with a cornucopia of crunchy and frequently sugar-laden, flaked, popped, and puffed grains. While perusing the cereal box, peering over the bowl, and gripping a spoonful of the stuff, few of these sleepy diners know that two men created those famously crispy golden flakes of corn. John and Will Kellogg were brothers from the Michigan hamlet of Battle Creek. Together they introduced and mass-marketed the concept of wellness, and in so doing, they transfigured breakfast. John and Will began their ascent into the pantheon of American history by building the Battle Creek Sanitarium, a once world-famous medical center, spa, and grand hotel. For more than 60 years, the San attracted droves of people actively pursuing health and well-being. The brothers also developed a successful medical publishing house, cooking, medical, and nursing schools, an undergraduate college, and sundry and other profitable health product companies. Yet throughout these endeavors, and for most of their lives, the Kellogg boys hated each other's guts. From the late 19th century to World War II, John, the eldest by 8 years, was one of America's most beloved physicians. His books were worldwide bestsellers. The advice he dispensed was followed by millions of people, including some of the most prominent celebrities of the day. In 1921, his research on digestion and diet was nominated for the Nobel Prize for Medicine or Physiology. 11 years later, a 1932 poll ranked him second on a list of 25 important American luminaries and lauded him as the noblest man in the United States. Only Herbert Hoover ranked higher that year. During this same period, Will founded and expanded the Battle Creek Toasted Cornflake Company into the Kellogg Company, which today enjoys more than $14 billion a year in net sales in breakfast cereals, snacks, and other manufactured foods in 180 nations around the globe. With Cunning and Elan, Will Kellogg revolutionized the mass production of food, invested a fortune to advertise his wares to the public, and as a result, made an even bigger fortune. When he was done amassing his wealth, he created the charitable means to give it away to those most in need. Behind all these triumphs, the Kellogg's filial relations were a mess. For decades, John and Will fought, litigated, and plotted against one another with a passion more akin to grand opera than the kinship of brothers. In their dotage, each brother came to regret their feud's acidic effects, even if they were never able to reach a peaceful resolution. In light of their incredible success, how could things have gone so horribly wrong between them? Thank you.
Good evening. These are going to be excerpts from the introduction to my book. Gorbachev is hard to understand, he said to me, referring to himself, as he often does, in the third person. I'd begun working on his biography in 2005, and a year later, he asked how it was going. Slowly, I apologized. That's all right, he said. Gorbachev is hard to understand. He has a sense of humor, and he was correct. The world is deeply divided about Gorbachev. Many, especially in the West, regard him as the greatest statesman of the second half of the 20th century. In Russia, however, he is widely despised by those who blame him for the collapse of the Soviet Union. Before Gorbachev took power in March 1985, the Soviet Union was one of the world's two superpowers. By 1989, he had transformed the Soviet system. By 1990, he, more than anyone else, had ended the Cold War. At the end of 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, leaving him a president without a country. How did Gorbachev become Gorbachev? How did a peasant boy whose high-flown tribute to Stalin won a high school prize, how did he turn into the Soviet system's gravedigger? How did he become the Communist Party boss, despite all the checks and guarantees designed to guard against someone just like him? As leaders go, Gorbachev was a remarkably decent man. Too decent, many Russians and some Westerners have said, too unwilling to use force when force was needed to save the democratic Soviet Union he was creating. Why, when his enemies were willing to use force to crush the freedom he had introduced, was he unwilling to use force to save it? Gorbachev's wife, Raisa, was a woman of intellect and good taste, even though Nancy Reagan didn't think so. Unlike too many politicians, Gorbachev loved and cherished his wife, and rare for a Soviet boss, he was a committed and involved father to his daughter and grandfather to his two granddaughters. What then made him feel, after his wife's agonizing death from leukemia at the age of 67, that, as he put it, "I am guilty. I am the one who did her in"? Gorbachev was an extraordinarily sure of himself, but when asked what characteristic he found most off-putting in another person, he answered self-confidence. And what in general irritated him most in other people? Haughtiness. Did he feel threatened by other self-assured men, or did he see himself in others and not like what he saw? Alexander Yakovlev, Gorbachev's closest collaborator in the Soviet leadership, thought Gorbachev found himself hard to understand, that he was afraid to look into himself and afraid to communicate candidly with himself, afraid to learn something he did not know and did not want to know. According to Yakovlev, Gorbachev, quote, always needed response, praise, support, sympathy, and understanding, which served as fuel for his vanity and self-esteem, as well as for his creative acts. If so, how did Gorbachev react when he had to watch much of his grand vision evaporate around him? Was he, in fact, a truly great leader? Or was he a tragic hero, brought low in the end, in part by his own shortcomings, but even more by the unyielding forces he faced? Thank you.
I have a long preamble to a short reading. Herbert Hoover had a lot of success in his life as a mining engineer, as an international humanitarian, as a two-term commerce secretary, but he could never win where Franklin Roosevelt was concerned. He thought he could win. In fact, when Hoover was up for re-election in 1932, he thought, as did many pundits at the time, that his chances of winning would be improved if the Democrats nominated Franklin Roosevelt, a notorious lightweight, as his Democratic opponent. Lightweight or not, Roosevelt won the nomination and quickly proved himself an exceptionally shrewd politician. He attacked Hoover from the right, accusing him of spending too much. He attacked Hoover from the left, accusing him of spending too little. He claimed that Hoover's tariff policy had caused the Great Depression. At the same time, he insisted that the Great Depression was entirely a domestic affair. Those contradictory statements were both known by informed opinion at the time to be false. Born to wealth and privilege, Roosevelt positioned Hoover, the orphan child of a humble frontier family, as a dangerous elitist, exploiting the American people on behalf of the not more than 5 individuals who controlled the American economy. Long before anyone had heard of Crooked Hillary, Roosevelt lumped Hoover in with those crooks in high finance who were robbing hardworking Americans of their savings. Roosevelt beat Hoover in 1932, and though the Republicans threw different candidates against him in 36 and in 40 and again in 1944, Roosevelt ignored these individuals and continued to campaign with great success against the Hoover Republicans. Hoover just couldn't win when it came to Roosevelt. But he hated the New Deal and pretty much every other Roosevelt policy, and he never gave up trying. The Second World War had taken a physical toll on Franklin Roosevelt, so much so that in the early months of 1945, close observers were beginning to doubt his competence. Anthony Eden had found him vague and loose and ineffective with Churchill and Stalin at the Yalta Conference in February, where they discussed the governance of post-war Europe. Eden did not know that Roosevelt had been diagnosed with heart disease almost a year earlier. No one did. At the end of March, with the fall of Nazi Germany in sight, the president traveled, ashen and weak, to what had become known as the Little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia. Just after noon on April 12th, while signing letters and having his portrait painted in the living room of his cottage, he felt a sharp pain, grabbed his head, and lost consciousness. And within 3 hours, he was dead. Herbert Hoover had just finished saying to the journalist Felix Morley that he hoped Roosevelt would live long enough to reap what he had sown when the announcement of his death came over the radio. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Joan Silber, and I'm just going to read you the first few pages of Improvement. Everyone knows this can happen. People travel and they find places they like so much, they think they've risen to their best selves just by being there. They feel distant from everyone at home who can't begin to understand. They take up with beautiful locals, they settle in, they get used to how everything works. They make homes, but maybe not forever. I had an aunt who was such a person. She went to Istanbul when she was in her 20s. She met a good-looking carpet seller from Cappadocia. She'd been a classics major in college and had many questions to ask him, many observations to offer. He was a gentle and intelligent man who spent his days talking to travelers. He'd come to think he no longer knew what to say to Turkish girls, and he loved my aunt's airy conversation. When her girlfriends went back to Greece, she stayed behind and moved in with him. This was in 1970. His shop was in Sultan Ahmet, where tourists went, and he lived in Fener, an old and jumbled neighborhood. Kiki, my aunt, liked having people over, and their apartment was always filled with men from her husband's region and expats of various ages. She was happy to cook big semi-Turkish meals and make up the couch for anyone passing through. She helped out in the store, explained carpet motifs to anyone who walked in. Those were stars for happiness, scorpion designs to keep real scorpions away. In her letters home, she sounded enormously pleased with herself. She dropped Turkish phrases into her sentences, reported days spent sipping chai or kahve. All this became lore in my family. She wrote to her father, who suffered from considerable awkwardness in dealing with his children. The mother had died some years before. She wrote to her brother, who was busy hating high school. Kiki sent home to Brooklyn a carpet, she said, was from the Taurus Mountains. Her father said, "Very handsome colors. I see you are a connoisseur. No one is walking on it, I promise." Then Kiki's boyfriend's business took a turn for the worse. There was a flood in the basement of his store, and a bill someone never paid, and a new shop nearby that was getting all the business, or something. The store had to close. Her family thought this meant that Kiki was coming home at last. But no, Osman, her guy, had decided to move back to the village he was from to help his father, who raised pumpkins for their seed oil, also tomatoes, green squash, and eggplant. Kiki was up for the move. She wanted to see the real Turkey. Istanbul was really so Western now. Cappadocia was very ancient, and she couldn't wait to see the volcanic rock. She was getting married. Her family in Brooklyn was surprised about that part. Were they invited to the wedding? Apparently not.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. I'm truly awed to be in this room with so much talent. I'm going to read the first words from my book, which were actually the last words I wrote. In 1904, Winslow Homer spent the month of January fishing midway up Florida's west coast, where the Homosassa River slips into the Gulf of Mexico. The painter laureate of the Atlantic had never been on the Gulf, and it delighted him with its natural palette of sea and shore, its color, movement, and history. Behind reedy coastal marshes rose a dense woodland, a jungle of green, as Homer portrayed it, where splaying air plants and ferns hung in mottled sunlight, and the scent of aromatic cypress and red bay trees vied with traces of rotting organic muck. Homer likely listened for the double knock of ivory-billed woodpeckers sounding from interior corners and studied the stealth pose of herons and egrets quietly fishing in the water. Its sweeping, calm service was the perfect vision of contentment, though a deceptive veneer over the restless energy below. Wherever Homer drifted with bait and tackle, the water beneath his rowing skiff was clear several feet to a grassy bottom, flush with crabs, mollusks, and 1,000 living things unseen. Among the most scintillating of sights were fish in schools as long as freight trains, running with the invisible Gulf tide. Their imposing numbers invited eagles and ospreys that circled overhead, and wading birds tending to the shallows. They invited Homer, too, on return trips for years after. He was 68 years old, trim as ever, mustached as always, and at the height of his fame as a painter. Together, Gulf nature and the patina of the past aroused Homer's artistic sensibility. He was prepared for such moments. Wherever he traveled with rod and reel, he carried paints and brushes. As he matured as an artist, the native scenery migrated on his canvas and paper from backdrop to focal point. In many of his Atlantic seascapes, human subjects appear in detail front and center, and often in contest with spirited, sometimes raging seas that speak to nature's paramount authority. Retaining this forthrightness in a composition of the Gulf, where the water was often as unruffled as a mill pond, required adjusting the scale of complementary elements. Among several watercolors that Homer completed at Homosassa, human subjects recede into a dab of color against a slate of restful water and wall of green, over which palm trees ascend toward buff clouds and into the center of each work. In one such painting, Shell Heap, sable palms shade an aboriginal mound spilling discarded oyster shells down to the water's edge, where two anglers float in a skiff, suggesting a continuity between the ancient and the recent. Like all of Homer's Homosassa paintings, Shell Heap conveys an intimate and vital connection linking humankind, nature, and history. I call this triad Homer's truth, and it lies at the heart of this book.
Do all of you remember Jim and Tammy Faye Baker? Yeah, well, they play a very small role in my book, but I just love them. So I have to read a bit of the part about them to you, and excuse my voice. I hope you can hear. As you remember, in October 1989, Jim went to jail, convicted of 24 counts of conspiracy and fraud. The prosecutors having made the case that Baker had bilked his clients out of $158 million and taken $3.5 million for himself. However, much of his congregation continued to believe in him. The Bakers had built a Christian Disneyland called Heritage USA near Charlotte, North Carolina, with a 163-foot water slide and a 15-foot-high fiberglass moose. At the Heritage Grand Hotel, they had a suite with a gold-plated bathroom fixtures and a 50-foot walk-in closet. They also had houses in 3 resorts and a fleet of automobiles, including 2 matching antique Rolls-Royces. Both Bakers had so many clothes that once the ministry hired a private jet to fly the clothes from North Carolina to California. On one of Jim's birthdays, Tammy announced that she had bought 2 giraffes as a present for Jim. By 1984, their TV station, PTL, was bringing in $66 million a year, but it had staggering expenses and often huge debts. Baker began to sell fraudulent lifetime partnerships in Heritage USA while taking larger and larger amounts of money for himself. Well, Baker wasn't the only minister to be caught with his hand in the till, but what made him unique was that almost nothing he ever did was a secret. To his television audience, he preached a religion based on faith in financial miracles and a religion of celebrity, showmanship, and fun. Its standard was excess, and its doctrines, tolerance, and freedom from guilt. A third-generation Assemblies of God evangelist, Jim had taken all the harsh prohibitions of the early Pentecostal church and turned them upside down and slightly askew. Tammy, with her huge hairdos, thick makeup, flashy outfits, and jewelry, presented almost a caricature of all that had been forbidden to Assemblies of God women. On the Bakers' show, the emphasis was always on drama and spectacles rather than Bible teaching. On television, the Bakers preached their own version of prosperity theology. Oral Roberts taught that if you gave to God, you would be repaid many times over. For the Bakers, there was nothing conditional about that promise. If you pray for a camper, tell him what color, Baker once advised his audience. Otherwise, you'll be asking God to do your shopping for you. Baker just had to pray on television, and millions of dollars floated out of envelopes at PTL. Baker claimed no credit for raising the money. That was God's work and a sign of his anointing. If Baker changed his mind about what to do with the money, that was the way the Spirit moved him. Apparently, it was not God's plan for him to give money to foreign missions as he had promised, but to build what he called the campground of the 21st century, complete with the water slide and a luxury hotel. Why should I apologize because God throws in crystal chandeliers, mahogany floors, and the best construction in the world? Baker once asked. Well, to many people who hadn't watched Baker before, this kind of talk seemed shockingly materialistic. I mean, why would God be involved with Baker's decor? And how could he be asked to deliver a camper that was, say, burgundy instead of navy blue? Well, the answer was that if a believer could look at it from the opposite point of view, it was not that supernatural was mundane, but rather the material world had a God-filled quality. The chandeliers were spiritual chandeliers, and the burgundy camper a sign of his presence in the world. It could, of course, be argued that a God who bothered to throw in some crystal chandeliers was not recognizably Christian. But then Baker was not alone in espousing prosperity theology, and to name a point at which the sacred became profane was to draw a doctrinal line in the sand. Thank you.
In August 2000, Losha went to the Black Sea coast with his mother. They spent their days at the beach, which was so crowded that they had to get there early to find a place to throw down a towel in the sand. And their evenings in the kitchen of a rented apartment, eating sickly sweet local grapes and listening to the radio. The news was as slow as the southern air until something inconceivable happened. According to the radio, a Russian nuclear submarine, the Kursk, had sunk off the coast of Murmansk. Some of the crew were still alive, but trapped at the bottom of the Barents Sea. The radio was saying that Russian rescue crews could not get to the submarine. The radio was also saying that Norway had offered to help, but Russia had declined. The radio was saying that President Putin had decided not to interrupt his vacation in Sochi. The days slowed down even more. In the fog of his sleepless nights and his circular daydreams, Losha kept imagining the sailors, boys a few years older than he was, at the bottom of the cold sea, waiting for help that could not get to them, and the president, the little man to whom Yeltsin had handed his office, somewhere quite near here, lying on a stretch of the Black Sea beach that was pristine and uncrowded, reserved for Putin's uninterruptible vacation. Thinking about all this was a relief, because Losha's thoughts before the submarine disaster had been even worse. Something had happened to Losha his first day at the beach. When he saw other boys, teenagers like himself or young men, dressed like he was in only a pair of small black bathing trunks, he felt heat shoot excruciatingly through his body, and a thrilling, invisible shiver set in. It happened every day after that first time. The thoughts it brought were unthinkable. I'm a pervert, he thought. I am sick. I am the only person in the world who feels this way. Now these awful phrases floating in his mind mixed with images of the sailors dying at the bottom of the sea. Rationally, Losha knew that there were homosexuals in the world. In 7th grade, his class had made a weekly visit to a family planning center where a psychologist talked to them about things their parents did not. The program was funded by American billionaire George Soros. The school had a contract with the center, and parents of the 7th graders had to sign consent forms to allow their children to attend. The psychologist happened to be the mother of Losha's friend, a girl whom he shared a desk with in every one of his classes. She was as unpopular as he was, not just with other children, but also with teachers who seemed to suspect her of being smarter than they were. Losha, for his part, had somehow earned the nickname faggot among fellow students. One day at the center, the psychologist said that in addition to heterosexual families, there were also homosexual families. The idea was sudden, exciting, and as foreign as Soros, the American billionaire. The following year, 8th grade, an older girl stormed into their class one day and asked loudly, "Did you know you had a prostitute in your grade?" She explained that 13 boys had locked the girl in question in a cellar and had taken turns having intercourse with her. She couldn't get out, said this accuser, and she liked it. Over the course of the next few days, the story was recounted many times as the male participants boasted of their roles in it. Their victim stayed out of school for a few weeks, and when she returned, she and Losha became friends. They were now a group of three: the faggot, the prostitute, and the snob. As they got older, some of their classmates seemed to develop respect for their intelligence and their ability to learn, explain, and argue about things. In 10th grade, the penultimate year of high school, Losha studied harder than ever before because this seemed the only way to chase away the thoughts that had begun tormenting him in August on the Black Sea. Toward the end of the school year, he was elected class president. Whatever some of his classmates thought of him, whatever led them to call Losha faggot, they agreed that he was the best person to represent their interests before the school administration. In May 2001, toward the end of 10th grade, Losha and his two friends were hanging out at the playground behind the building. They were too old for playgrounds, of course, but in the absence of other public spaces, all young people in Solikamsk hung out in playgrounds, especially when the weather was good. A girl strolled by. She was one of the kids who used to sleep on Losha's stairway, except she was not a kid anymore. She called out to someone who happened to be walking by, a man of about 30. He sauntered over. She pointed at Losha. "Faggot," she said. The man took a short running start and kicked Losha in the lower back. Then again, his eyes were crazy, empty, and furious at the same time, and Losha knew that he was about to be beaten to death. Losha's stepfather happened to come out on the balcony just then. This gave him a clear view of the playground. "Get out of here," barked the girl. Losha ran. At the emergency room, he was told there was bleeding and that he now had a condition called a floating kidney. Literally, one of his kidneys was no longer securely attached by surrounding tissue. The pain was excruciating, and to relieve it and to avoid surgery, he would have to stay in bed for 2 weeks. Losha's mother wanted to go to the police, but Losha was terrified that the reason for the beating would then be revealed. Because if he had to explain what happened to him, he would have to say, "I am gay." Thank you.